It's been a while since I've tackled a classic, and with the recent Steam release and controversial console release of Control Ultimate Edition, I decided to dive back into Remedy's catalog so I'd have the context necessary to properly analyze that game. I was a huge fan of Remedy's Max Payne and an even bigger fan of its follow-up, Max Payne 2: The Fall of Max Payne, the game which to this day has the best cover art I've ever seen. However, excuse the dad joke, but I slept on their subsequent game, 2010's Alan Wake. Get it? Slept on Alan Wake. Awake. Slept on being awake. 10 out of 10 dad joke. Seconds after I finished Horizon Zero Dawn, I booted up my DRM-free GOG copy of Alan Wake, and man, it's a seriously awesome game. One of the benefits to playing a decade-old game is that on a modern PC, it runs at absolute max settings at the highest resolution your monitor can support at pretty much whatever frame rate you want without any issues. The only downside was that this game, in addition to Horizon Zero Dawn and Remedy's own Quantum Break, all have pre-rendered cinematic sequences which were not updated, so whenever a major story beat happens in Alan Wake, the game bumps down to 720p at 30 frames a second, with what clearly looks like decade-old video compression. So if you're a game developer and are thinking we can boost the visual quality of these cutscenes by pre-rendering them instead of doing them in real time with the game engine, pump the brakes and remember that it won't be long before people are playing your game on hardware which can run triple the quality of your current pre-renders. Real-time rendering scales over time. You can bump up the resolution, the graphics setting, and the frame rate. Pre-renders are stuck the way they were captured forever. While I don't normally talk about the technical stuff right away, I wanted to make sure you're aware of why the cutscenes in this video look so bad when compared to the gameplay. Unless you're watching this on a phone in 360p, then they probably look the same. Now that the pre-rendered cinematic PSA is over with, let's talk about the game itself. Alan Wake is a narrative-driven psychological thriller, a bit of a horror game, but mostly it's a shooter. The premise seems relatively simple at first. Best-selling writer Alan Wake is taking a vacation in a small town in the Pacific Northwest with his wife Alice. During their first night, Alice is pulled into the lake and Alan jumps in after her. The next thing we know, Alan is waking up in a wrecked car 1 week later with no memory of what happened in between. We take control of Alan as he investigates Alice's disappearance, and things get weirder and weirder from there. It's not long before Alan finds that he's in a life-and-death battle against a being known as the Dark Presence, who has the ability to create humanoid apparitions to attack Alan. These apparitions are known as the Taken and are protected by a shield made of dark shadows. This is where the hook of Alan Wake's combat comes into play. In order to do damage to any of the enemies, Alan needs to shine a light on them until their shields burst, at which point he can do damage with his guns. Your primary means of producing light are the various flashlights you can pick up. Holding the right mouse button or the left trigger on a controller lets you power up the light, which burns their shields faster, but will also drain your battery power. You can replace batteries instantaneously if you have spares on hand, but if you don't, you'll have to wait until your battery recharges. This creates some intense encounters in which you have to be creative about enemy position management, make decisions about when and how you'll power up your flashlight, and which weapons to use on which enemies. While this is certainly a game with horror elements, ammo is not very hard to come by, but it's also not plentiful in the way it would be in a straight-up action game, so saving your shotgun shells or hunting rifle rounds for powerful enemies is a good bet. There are also throwable items in the form of flares and flashbang grenades. You can spark a flare and hold it before you drop it, but regardless it will do light damage to everything around it, albeit in a short radius. The flashbang grenades, on the other hand, are essentially your panic button. They do such powerful light and physical damage to everything around them that they flat out kill most low-powered enemies and are fantastic for crowd control. The other panic button weapon is the flare gun, which functions the same way a rocket launcher would in most shooters. The strength of an enemy's darkness shield is represented by a circular lens flare, which shrinks as you light the enemy up, culminating in a pop which lets you know it's time to start shooting. When you kill an enemy, there's an extremely satisfying burst sound, which accompanies an animation of them being engulfed in light, and when you kill the last enemy in an encounter, the game kicks into slow motion, evoking Remedy's own Max Payne games. Like the Max Payne series, the gunplay is also very tight, and Alan Wake's horror elements don't really overwhelm the gameplay. The ammo count always feels about right. You never feel like you have tons of ammo and can miss shots frequently, but you also don't ever feel like you need to micromanage your resources. You can only carry one long gun at a time, so it's a bit of a bummer to have to choose between using one of the shotguns or a hunting rifle, but it does serve the game balance quite well. In addition to the standard human enemies, there are also inanimate objects and flocks of ravens which can be possessed by the Dark Presence. These enemies need only be attacked with light rather than light and bullets, but they're very powerful and do a nice job of making the combat feel a bit more varied. There are also creative opportunities for creating light in the environment, like work lamps, spotlights, or ovens to utilize, and every so often you can jump in a car and use its high beams. Sadly, when you're behind the wheel, the handling is flat out bad, which makes me think Remedy made a smart decision to shift the game from an open-world horror game to a more linear narrative experience. That's not to say that open-world horror can't work very well, as one of my favorite games of this past generation was The Evil Within 2, and it proved that mixing scripted scary sequences with a flexible open world was very possible. I'm not sure that Alan Wake would have worked if it went that route though. In addition to the wonky driving physics, the narrative structure is so tight that I can only imagine that filling the game with open-world side objectives would break the pacing and make the game feel much less focused. The structure of Alan Wake follows a scripted day-night cycle, which are mostly based around each episode of the game. There are 5 episodes in the main game, with 2 DLC episodes that act as an epilogue to the story of sorts, each with their own licensed end credits song and a "Previously on Alan Wake" intro. During an episode, you have a daytime section in which you speak to NPCs, search around an area, and engage in the immersive world building that Remedy is so great at. There's no combat in any of these segments, but they are fairly linear and quite short, so it won't be long before the sun goes down and you're back into the action. The daytime segments do a lot in order to immerse you into the surreal world of the game, which has an interesting narrative concept. While I don't want to show all the cards and spoil the experience, I will say that it unfolds much like a Stephen King story, and it's no coincidence that Alan is a Stephen King-like fiction writer. Alan's ability to write factors heavily into the plot and accounts for a lot of the surreal things which happen, as the game takes place in a story which he has already written. The story is simply unfolding as he wrote it. It might sound like really highbrow, surreal stuff, but it plays much more like a pulpy Stephen King novel, and I was totally on board. It takes a lot of cues from the back half of the Dark Tower series. You should absolutely read those books, by the way, but you never need to watch the movie. It was not good. The ending is a bit ambiguous, and while the 2 DLC chapters do pick up where it leaves off, even they mostly set up a sequel, which as of now has not happened. There's another game in the series called Alan Wake's American Nightmare, but it's an action-focused spin-off rather than a true sequel. I may cover that at some point too though. It's a lot of fun and really just a great excuse to have more of the awesome Alan Wake combat. Over the last few weeks, I've been playing through a bunch of Remedy's games, and they're constructing something of a cinematic universe. I didn't get more than 5 minutes into Quantum Break before there was a direct reference to Alan Wake, and the final DLC for Control features Alan himself, as portrayed by his actor Matthew Peretta. I've only recently started diving into Remedy's world, but it's very flexible, fascinating, and has a healthy mix of dark, moody atmosphere and self-aware meta-humor. For example, in one area of Alan Wake, there's a QR code on the wall, and if you scan it with your real-world cell phone, it takes you to a constipation meme of Remedy's creative director Sam Lake doing his Max Payne face. Alan's agent provides a lot of laughs and lighthearted humor.
Guess that one saw the light, huh? You didn't like that one? A tough audience. Well, I got plenty more.
What are the Christmas lights for?
Protection, man! Like garlic against vampires?
And the former rockstar Viking bikers are hilarious, and their subplot pays off very well.
God damn.
But when things need to get serious, the tone straightens up and manages to convey pretty effective horror while still being much closer to a stylish action game than a survival horror game. All in all, Alan Wake is an incredible game which has aged very well and is absolutely worth your time. Whether you're looking for a solid thriller with a good story, curious to dip your toe into Remedy's shared universe, or even if you just feel like playing a fun shooter. It's available on GOG and Steam on PC and on Xbox 360, Xbox One, or Xbox Series X via Game Pass due to backwards compatibility. Just remember to bring some extra batteries.